Once upon a time, there were 25 tin soldiers, and they were all brothers because they'd all been made from one large tin spoon. They were all neatly dressed in red, blue, and white uniforms, and each one held a little rifle. As soon as the toy maker had made them, he put them in a little wooden box on a shelf in his shop. For months, they waited patiently, packed into the box like sardines, until one day a man came into the shop and bought the box. "This'll make a fine present for my son's birthday," he said. When the little boy saw the box, he rattled it and tried to guess what was in it. When he opened it, he shouted out, "Tin soldiers!" And as the little boy shouted this out, he clapped his hands with excitement. Then he took a close look at the soldiers and noticed that they were all exactly the same, except for one, who was slightly different from the rest. He only had one leg, as he was the last to be made, and there wasn't enough tin left to give him another leg. But this brave little soldier stood upright and proud like the others, even though he only had one leg to stand on and the others had two. The boy stood the one-legged soldier right in front of his paper castle. This beautiful little castle looked just like a real castle in miniature. Delicate paper trees and a lake made from a mirror stood in front of it. It was a beautiful scene, and it filled the little tin soldier's heart with joy, especially when he saw the pretty little girl who stood at the door of the castle. She had been intricately cut out of paper and was dressed in a dancer's costume with a red rose at the waist that was as big as her face. The beautiful girl stretched her arms high above her head because she was a ballerina. One of her legs was raised so high that the little tin soldier couldn't see it and thought she only had one leg. "That's the wife for me," he thought. But she's far too grand. Her home is a beautiful castle, and I live in a simple wooden box. Still, I might as well try to make friends with her. But although he couldn't stop looking at the beautiful ballerina, he couldn't muster up enough courage to speak to her. Later that evening, all the other tin soldiers were packed into their box and everybody went to bed. As soon as everyone in the house was fast asleep, all the other toys started dancing round the room. The coloured pencils stood upright and started to do a merry little tap dance. The top spun around furiously and the clockwork mouse whizzed along the floor. Two wooden dolls played happily on a little seesaw, while a tiny clown balanced in the middle. The only toys who didn't move were the little tin soldier and the ballerina. On the strike of 12, the lid flew off a little wooden box and a cheeky little jack-in-the-box leapt up on his spring. He laughed heartily, and as he laughed, all the bells in his hat made a loud jingling noise. "Tin soldier," said the jack-in-the-box, "please keep your eyes to yourself." But the soldier stood firm and pretended that he hadn't heard him. "You'll be sorry when tomorrow comes," said the jack-in-the-box. All the toys made such a noise that they woke the canary, so he decided to join in the fun. At sunrise, all the toys went back into their boxes and the canary flew back into his cage. All was quiet again. As soon as the children of the house woke up, the little tin soldier was put on the windowsill. But he had only been standing there for a few minutes when the window flew open and he fell out head first into the garden below. To this day, nobody knows whether it was the cheeky jack-in-the-box who pushed him out or the draft caused by the wind. The poor little soldier suffered a bad fall because he'd fallen from one of the rooms at the top of the house. His leg stuck straight up in the air and he was left upside down in the garden with his rifle caught between two large rocks. He was completely stuck and he couldn't budge an inch. When they noticed that he had gone, the servant and the little boy dashed straight out into the garden to look for him, and although they very nearly trod on him, they couldn't find him. The tin soldier was so sad to see them passing by and wanted to shout out, "I'm here!" But he didn't think it was the proper thing for a soldier to do as he was dressed in uniform. Then it started to rain, and the rain fell so heavily that the tin soldier almost drowned in a little pool of water. When the downpour was over, 2 street urchins who had crept into the garden wandered by. "Look what I found," said one of them. "It's a little tin soldier. Let's put him in a little boat and send him for a sail." So they picked up a few sheets of old newspaper and made them into a little boat. They lifted the tin soldier up and stood him in it. And in his head, the little soldier kept repeating, "Leave me alone." He desperately wanted to shout these words out, but he knew it wasn't the correct thing for a soldier in uniform to do. So he kept quiet. The 2 urchins sailed the little boat along the gutter.
Oh, look at him.
As it drifted along, they ran alongside it, clapping their hands. Oh, what huge waves and a strong current there was in the gutter. The boat bobbed up and down, and it whirled around with such speed that the tin soldier felt seasick. But he was a brave little soldier, and he stood upright without moving a muscle. He kept looking straight ahead and held his rifle tightly at his side. Suddenly, the boat came to a long stretch of gutter that was covered over. It was darker than his box. "I wonder what's going to happen to me now," said the little tin soldier. "I'm sure it's all that Jack in the Box's fault. Oh, how I wish I had the little ballerina with me in the boat. If she were here, I wouldn't care, even if it were twice as dark as this." Suddenly, a large water rat appeared. "Where's your passport?" asked the rat. "Come on, show me your passport." But the tin soldier didn't reply. He just kept on clutching his rifle very tightly indeed. The boat drifted away, and the rat chased after it. "Stop him! Stop him! He hasn't shown me his passport!" shouted the rat. But the current grew stronger and stronger, and the tin soldier could see daylight ahead, where the covered part of the gutter ended, and what a horrible sight he could see before him as he bobbed along in the little boat. The gutter emptied straight out into a drain, and he was heading straight for it. It was as dangerous for him to be swept into this as it would be for us to sail over a waterfall. But it was no use him crying out, even if he'd wanted to, because he was so near to the end that he couldn't stop. "I wish I was on dry land and in the arms of the ballerina," he thought to himself. And then the boat swept over the side. But still, the brave little soldier clutched his rifle and kept completely still. With an almighty splash, the soldier and his boat were swept out of the gutter and into the drain. The water rat watched in amazement as he saw the little paper boat and its passenger disappearing into the opening of the drain. Empty bottles and cans that were more than twice his size followed the little soldier on his terrifying journey. The little paper boat traveled on through the drain until it emptied out into a big canal. Imagine a little tin soldier lost in a canal. It would be just as terrifying for us if we were lost in one of the vast oceans of the world. The boat spun round several times until it was full to the brim with water. By now, the tin soldier could only just keep his head above water, but he still kept completely upright. "This boat is going to sink. I just know it, and there's nothing I can do about it," he thought. And just as he'd feared, the boat sank deeper and deeper into the water, and the newspaper became more and more sodden. Eventually, the water gushed right over the tin soldier's head. While this was happening, all he could think of was the beautiful little ballerina. Oh, how he wished he could see her face again. After this, the paper boat fell apart and the tin soldier fell straight through the bottom. As soon as he had parted from the boat, he was swallowed by a great big fish. It was so dark inside its belly, but the tin soldier stood perfectly still with his rifle tightly at his side, although he was now lying lengthways. The fish twisted and turned so much that the tin soldier didn't know what was going on. "When will this ever end?" the tin soldier said to himself. Then, suddenly, all the terrifying twists and turns stopped, and the fish lay quite still. A flash of lightning seemed to pass right through the fish, and suddenly the soldier could see daylight again. Somebody called out, "It's a tin soldier!" The fish had been caught, taken to market, and sold. A servant took it home to the kitchen, where she slit it open with a big sharp knife. The servant was so surprised when she saw the soldier and the fish that she gently picked him up by the waist and took him to the room where supper was being served. Everybody stared at this amazing little man as the servant told them that he had been travelling inside a fish. "What's all the fuss about?" he thought. "I haven't done anything special." They stood the tin soldier on the table, and what a wonderful sight met his eyes. He was in exactly the same room as he'd been in before. He recognized the same little boy. The same toys were on the table. And most wonderful of all, the lovely paper castle with its pretty little ballerina stood straight in front of him. Still, the little ballerina stood with her arms stretched out above her head and one leg raised high in the air. She looked as if she had been waiting patiently for him to return. This touched the heart of the little tin soldier. He felt he could weep tin tears, but he knew that that was not the proper thing for a soldier in uniform to do. He looked at her, and she looked at him, but they didn't say a single word. The boy stood him under one of the paper trees so that he was closer to her, but still they didn't say a single word to each other. The little tin soldier wanted to ask her to be his wife, but he still felt she was too grand for him, so he just looked on. Although not a word passed between them, all the other toys were happy to see them standing together. Except for the Jack-in-the-Box, of course, who didn't wish good fortune on anybody. He was too busy whispering into the ear of the little boy. "Throw that good-for-nothing soldier into the stove," he said. "He can't fight battles for you with only one leg." The little boy was frightened of the Jack-in-the-Box. So he did as he was told, and threw the poor little soldier straight into the blazing stove.
"A useless soldier."
As the tin soldier stood in the heat of the fire, he soon became incredibly hot. The poor little soldier didn't know if it was the heat of the flames that was making him feel like this, or the heat of his love for the ballerina. Soon, the bright red, white, and blue of his uniform started to fade away. Nobody knew whether the color had faded because of the heat or because he was so sad. He could still see the little ballerina with her arms reaching towards him, and as he looked at her, she looked at him. In the intense heat, he started to melt, but he still stood brave and upright with his rifle at his side. Then, a gust of wind blew in through the window. It caught the ballerina, and she flew into the stove with the little tin soldier. For a few brief moments, they looked at each other as the red and yellow flames danced around them. Although not a word was spoken, it didn't matter, because they were united forever in love. A few minutes later, they both burst into flames and completely vanished. The next morning, when the maid was clearing out the ashes in the stove, she found all that was left of the little tin soldier, a little lump of tin in the shape of a heart. Next to it lay the big red rose that the ballerina had worn, burnt black as a piece of coal.